Dan Kenner took a sip of bourbon and picked up his iPad. He had received a text from his wife telling him he would be working late again and should go to dinner on his own. Dan liked to plan. Since he had a night to himself, Dan's plan was to have a cheeseburger at Whataburger and spend the evening with Lee Child's latest Jack Reacher novel and a bottle of 13-year-old Malam and green bourbon that his father-in-law had given him. He had been saving the bottle for the right moment, and tonight promised to be that moment. Dan took another sip of bourbon and set the iPad down on the side table as he savored the 111 proof amber liquid and reflected on his current situation. Kendall, Dan's wife of 6 years, had been working a lot of overtime for the past 6 months. Early in their marriage, they agreed to pay an equal amount each month into their joint checking account to pay bills and fund vacations, but their personal savings, checking, and retirement accounts were kept completely separate, and neither had access to the other's accounts. As a salaried employee, Kendall's income did not increase for additional hours, so whether Kendall worked 40 hours a week or 60, her income remained the same. With separate personal accounts, Dan didn't know whether Kendall earned too much or too little from her overtime. The amount they each contributed to their joint account was far more than necessary for expenses, and the balance had grown considerably. This separation of accounts was something Kendall had insisted on before they were married. Dan's business was struggling due to the general economic downturn when he and Kendall met, and there were weeks and months when Dan refused to pay himself. That's the thing about owning a business. The garbage man gets paid before you do. Dan refused to lay off any employees and dipped more and more into his personal savings to keep the promise he had made to himself that no one would lose their job. It was one step after another, trudging through life, and when he closed his stores at nightfall, all he found was himself getting older and deeper in debt by the day. Kendall made a decent salary as a staff accountant for a Fortune 500 company and stayed out of Dan's business. She feared the company's bankruptcy and stayed away from it. Dan had lived on savings during those lean years so as not to burden Kendall, and, although he sometimes struggled to meet his obligations to fund their joint account, he was always able to put his share into the account knowing that the storm would eventually pass. Dan was able to not only weather the storm, but thrive. The collection of 3 auto repair shops he had inherited from his father had grown into a small chain of 12 stores in the last 2 years. In the next 3 years, he had acquired land that would allow him to expand the chain to 20 shops. All the stores were in the red, but Dan had deliberately kept his salary as low as possible and reinvested the profits in the business. All the stores had acquired tire equipment capable of mounting and balancing any size tire on any type of wheel, no matter how exotic. State-of-the-art diagnostic equipment enabled their technicians to diagnose and repair drivability problems on almost every vehicle manufactured in North America, Asia, and Europe, except in France, because screw Peugeots. So Dan's business was going like crazy. Kendall's job was going well. This should have been the happiest time of their lives, but cracks were appearing in their marriage. This was the second marriage for Dan and Kendall. Dan's first wife had been killed by an elderly driver while out for an early morning run. It was a clear, sunny morning with a bit of an October chill in the air. Because of the morning glow, the octogenarian driving to her doctor did not see Kendall running down the street. The city was repairing a damaged culvert and had torn up the sidewalk, forcing Lizzie to run down the street about 20 feet. It didn't take much more. 20 freaking feet. 5 seconds of footage and 2 lives snuffed out. Lizzie didn't know it yet, but she was 4 weeks pregnant when the car hit her. It was the second time tragedy had struck the Kenner home. Dan's mother had died of lung cancer when he was in high school. He had never smoked a cigarette in his life when he developed a persistent cough for which he sought treatment. 8 weeks after the diagnosis, she had passed away. It took Dan months to recover from Lizzie's death. His father installed an interim manager at the store Dan ran. This gave Dan time to mourn his wife and the child he would never have. Dan might never have recovered had his father not suffered a fatal heart attack while driving home from his office store one afternoon. This forced Dan to put aside his grief and focus on the business. People depended on him for a living. It was due to a careless accident that Dan met Kendall. An apprentice mechanic had removed the radiator cap without waiting for the engine to cool down as Dan was passing by. Hot antifreeze sprayed Dan's chest, and he had to go to the emergency room. The ER waiting room was crowded with the assortment of ER visitors seen in most cities. Open head wounds, overdoses, withdrawal, and an assortment of injuries and wounds, typical of what the ER staff referred to as BRIs, short for beer-related injuries. The seat next to Dan's was empty, and Dan himself looked non-threatening, although he looked like he had been doused with some kind of greenish liquid that gave off a slightly sweet and unpleasant smell at the same time. A tall, attractive brunette jumped up and hobbled over to Dan, before plopping down in the empty seat next to him. Since the ER was crowded, they knew they were in for a long wait. They told each other about their injuries. Kendall had sprained her ankle while out for a run after work, and gave each other a rundown of their lives. There was an immediate attraction between Dan and Kendall. Dan asked her out to dinner and she accepted. They hit it off and quickly became a couple. Kendall had divorced her first husband for emotional abuse and cheating, and from their first date, she had told Dan that she had no tolerance for cheaters. They married 15 months after they met. Dan took a sip of his whiskey and thought about his marriage. What was the old joke? We've been happily married for 5 years. Unfortunately, we got married 6 years ago. For the first few years of their marriage, Dan and Kendall were ecstatically happy. They laughed together. They danced. They made love all the time. They were good together. The problem started when Kendall finished her MBA and was kicked out of the bank that had hired her out of college to work as an accountant at the Fortune 500 company she now worked for. Dan was supportive. He wanted Kendall to be happy and successful. There came a time when one of the senior vice presidents was going to retire, and the senior director he reported to was running for the position. That would leave the SD position vacant, and Kendall thought he had a good chance of moving up. He just had to prove that he really wanted the job. After a few months, Dan realized that Kendall was becoming curt with him. Nothing he did seemed right. Kendall began to disrespect him at work. To her, he was now just a mechanic, a grease monkey. He started disrespecting her in every conversation. Her constant anger and irritation with her husband was a divisive force in their marriage. Kendall started working overtime to stay away from Dan. When she was home, she would type messages on her phone. Her phone. God, how he hated his phone. He was always on his phone. She secretly laughed at the messages that came in. She would turn the screen so her husband couldn't see who she was texting and what they were about. She slept with her phone under her pillow, and then things turned violent. Kendall had always had a short temper and was quick to anger. This usually took the form of a cutting remark or a stab at the target of her anger. She had always calmed down quickly and made amends when her temper had gotten the better of her, and when Dan was the focus of her anger, her repentance would translate into a night of good sex. However, Dan had found that her angry outbursts were escalating and lasting longer, but without the makeup sex that, in the past, had made her temper somewhat tolerable. A month ago, during an argument Kendall had fabricated for no reason, he slapped her. In more than 6 years of marriage, neither Dan nor Kendall had ever raised a hand to each other. But she had slapped him, and that had shocked Dan. The slap had also shocked Kendall, who immediately apologized and asked for forgiveness. But then came the coffee cup incident. A week after the slap, Kendall yelled at Dan because his BMW's oil change light had come on and he hadn't changed it. Dan had explained to Kendall, again, that his BMW came with free oil changes for the first 3 years, so it didn't make any sense for him to change the oil when the BMW dealer would do it for free. Kendall had yelled at Dan, "Change the oil for the hell of it, jerk!" Enough of that crap for Dan. I told you not to buy that car, but you had to have that expensive, unreliable German junk. So now that you have it, it's up to you to maintain it. Make an appointment at the BMW dealership. This is up to you. Kendall had become enraged. She picked up her coffee mug and threw it at Dan's head. If he hadn't ducked, the phone would have hit him in the center of the forehead. Dan looked at Kendall dumbfounded. She returned his gaze expressionlessly before turning on her heel and walking away without a word. Dan took another sip of his whiskey. He heard the garage door open, indicating Kendall was coming home. Dan picked up his cell phone and sent the text message and email he had queued up. They were redundant, addressed to the same person, and contained the same packet of information, so it didn't matter which one was received first or if one of them didn't go through. Dan was a firm believer in contingency plans. As Tennessee Ernie Ford had sung so long ago, "If the one on the right doesn't get you, the one on the left will." As Kendall walked across the room, she glanced at Dan, comfortable in his easy chair with a glass of whiskey in his hand. "I'm going to change, and then I have to ask you about some strange activity on the joint account." Kendall didn't wait for Dan to acknowledge his statement as he headed for the bedroom. A couple of minutes later, Dan heard the shower turn on. Both Dan and Kendall had set up notifications on their banking apps to alert them of any unusual activity. Dan had received the same text notifications that Kendall was no doubt concerned about. He sighed, took a sip of his bourbon, and set the iPad aside as he waited for Kendall to return. And so she did 15 minutes later, dressed in black yoga pants and a white t-shirt that exposed her belly, as she plopped down on the couch across from Dan. Her hair was wet and slicked back from the shower, and although she hadn't put her makeup back on, she was an incredibly beautiful woman. Her body was slender and athletic, topped by a pair of C-cup breasts that were, for the moment, braless. "Do you know about those joint account deductions?" he asked. There was a slight accusatory tone in her voice. He held out his cell phone to Dan. His bank's app was open to check the activity in their joint checking account. The balance was $12, whereas before it had been over $30,000. Dan nodded his head. "The 12,000 ACH debit to PDSC? That's Pendragon Security Consultants. It was to pay them for following you around for a month and documenting your affair with your boss. The 18,000 ACH to SKD? That was the retainer to Solomon, Klein, and Davis, my divorce lawyers." He took a sip of his bourbon and waited for Kendall's reaction. Her eyes filled with tears, and she opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water, trying to find oxygen. Her face reddened, and for a moment, Kendall seemed speechless. Dan watched as his emotions flashed across his face. Fear turned to sadness, which in turn turned to anger and back to fear. She seemed stuck, and only when Dan lifted her glass to take a sip of her bourbon did she seem to decide to say something. "It didn't mean anything," Kendall said. "I just got caught up in something I couldn't control. I'm going to end it right now. I don't want a divorce. Weren't you the one who said I had zero tolerance for cheaters? What did that mean to you?" "If you ever cheated on me, I'd divorce you," Kendall said, looking down at her hands clasped in her lap. "It sounds like a smart plan," Dan said. "I don't want a divorce," Kendall repeated. "What did you think would happen when I found out?" asked Dan. "I didn't think you'd find out," Kendall said sincerely. "I thought our affair would run its course and you and I would get back to normal. What about the disrespect? The anger and abuse? Was I supposed to let it go?" "I never disrespected you, and there was no abuse," Kendall said, raising her voice slightly as she denied Dan's accusation. "Did you bang him in our bed?" asked Dan. Kendall let out a gasp and the blood drained from his face. "Yes," she said quietly, "but I meant no disrespect." "Oh, then it's all right. As long as you didn't disrespect me, it's all right," Dan said with a touch of annoyance. "You banged your mistress in our marital bed, in our marital home, and you don't think that's disrespectful to me? And you were saying that there was no abuse?" Dan let out a sly laugh. "You slapped me and threw a cup of coffee at my head. So yes, there was abuse. We can get through this." "I don't want a divorce," Kendall insisted. "We can work it out. I'll make an appointment for us to see a marriage counselor." Dan shook his head. "Our marriage wasn't the problem. Your cheating was the problem. I agree that it takes therapy, but not to fix our marriage. You need to fix whatever is broken in you. If your boyfriend was single, you'd be out of here at the first thing that smoked. He's not getting divorced, so I'm your plan B." "Well, screw that noise. I don't want a divorce," Kendall repeated emphatically. "You'll change your mind," Dan said with a wry smile. Kendall's phone had been buzzing with incoming notifications the entire time she and Dan were talking, but she had been ignoring the notifications as she appealed to Dan. Receiving a call, she looked down, annoyed. "You should probably take it," Dan said. Kendall got up from the couch and headed to the master bedroom in search of privacy. As she walked away, Dan grabbed his cell phone, tapped a couple of apps he had previously opened, and then hit the post button. Dan could hear Kendall's muffled voice but couldn't understand it until she said loudly, "He did what?" A few minutes later, Kendall returned to the living room. Her face was red and her eyes were narrowed and furious. "Did you tell his wife? Did you tell his wife?" he yelled. "How dare you try to destroy their marriage? You had no right. They have 2 little kids. How could you be so hateful to her? You miserable asshole. You sorry piece of shit. I'll never forgive you for hurting her like that." Dan looked at Kendall in bewilderment. "So, in your mind, he's not a miserable asshole for cheating on his wife. I'm the miserable asshole for telling him he's cheating on her? You got some badass logic, baby. You don't consider you and your boyfriend to be miserable pieces of shit for lying and cheating on your wives. But I'm the bad guy for bringing it to light?" Dan shook his head and let out a chuckle. In his quest to understand infidelity, he had recently read about the twisted logic of cheaters, but to see it in his own wife was crazy. "This is between you and me. You had no business interfering in their marriage," shouted Kendall, her face red with anger. "Your boyfriend had no problem getting in the middle of my marriage, so I had no problem getting in the middle of his marriage. If he's cheating on her with a coworker, there's no telling what kind of sluts and whores he's cheating on her with. She needs to protect herself and get tested for STDs. He's not like that, and he's clean. Since the first thing you do when you get home after working late is shower, I assume you have unprotected sex with him. You should get tested too. I got tested for my peace of mind. even though we haven't had sex since you started your affair. Kendall looked at her husband in surprise. He had known for months, and he was acting like nothing was wrong while he was hiring private investigators. Who was this man? You just wanted revenge. You're pathetic, Kendall said. Dan again became aware of her phone buzzing with the incoming notifications he had been ignoring while hurling insults at her. When he paused for a breath, her phone began to ring. You should probably drink that, Dan said again as he took another sip of bourbon. Kendall headed back toward the master bedroom to answer the phone. Dan made a call on his iPhone and quickly mumbled into the phone. He then opened the recording app on his iPhone and propped it up on the lamp on the side table next to his chair. The phone was recording Dan while holding the line open, so the person on the other end of the line could hear what was going on. Dan sat on his hands as he waited for his wife to return. He didn't have to wait long. Kendall practically flew into the living room. You posted this on Facebook, she screamed. You posted this on Facebook and tagged all of my family and friends. You tagged Pastor Riley. Well, yes. But to be fair, I also posted it on LinkedIn so all your professional contacts could see it too. Kendall screamed in frustration and anger before throwing her cell phone at Dan's head. Dan closed his eyes as she reared back and braced for the blow. When it came, it was much worse than he expected. He nearly fainted when the phone hit his forehead, but managed to keep his sanity. He knew she was going to do something, and crossing his arms to avoid killing that bitch was one of the hardest things he had ever done. Kendall jumped over the space separating them and began punching him in the face. Dan felt his lips split, and the coppery taste of blood hit his mouth. It hit him in the nose, and Dan's vision blurred for a moment. Finally, there came a moment when he stopped sitting on his hands and covered his face with his arms as she continued to hit him. Kendall yelled, I'm going to take you down, you bastard! I'm going to get a weapon and blow your goddamn head off! Finally, Dan had had enough and gently pushed her away as he got up and walked a few steps away, placing a two-seater couch between him and Kendall. If the 911 operator Dan had called had done his job right, he would only have to wait a couple of minutes for the patrol car to arrive. And that's exactly what happened. Kendall stared at Dan with hate-filled eyes. Her chest heaved as she took a deep breath. She was trying to figure out the best way to go after Dan. To the left? To the right? Over the couch? The doorbell rang before she could devise a plan of attack. You should probably take it, Dan said, his voice flat and impassive. Kendall smiled and squinted as she looked Dan in the eye. She paused for a moment, spun on her heel and headed for the front door. Kendall pushed open the door and was met by two police officers. Her expression was a mixture of confusion and anger as she spoke to the officers and glanced at Dan every few sentences. The officers and Kendall were too far away for Dan to make out their mumbling conversation. He could see Kendall gesticulate wildly and point her finger at him. Dan could see Kendall turn away and allow the agents to enter his house. He escorted one of the agents out of the living room and into the kitchen. The other agent approached Dan. Mr. Kenner, I'm Patrolman Diaz and my partner is Patrolman Agnew. Your wife says you've been violent with her tonight. Why don't you tell me what's going on? Have you touched her? Dan shook his head. I confronted my wife about an affair she's having. She attacked me. Dan pointed to his face. He could feel the blood on his face from taking the hit from the thrown cell phone. He could also feel his split lip. I was the one who called 911. She's been getting violent lately. She slapped me a month ago, and a week later she threw a cup of coffee at my head. She missed me, but otherwise I would have had to go to the emergency room. I recorded the confrontation tonight. Would you like to see the video? Patrolman Diaz did want to see the video. Dan made several taps on his iPhone and then handed the phone to the officer. Patrolman Diaz watched the video in silence, raising his eyebrows at the scene of Kendall throwing herself at Dan. The policeman looked at Dan skeptically. It sounds like there was a conversation before the recording. Was anything said that might aggravate the situation? Dan shrugged. She found out that she'd had a private investigator following her for a month and that he'd passed the results on to his romantic partner's wife. She wasn't amused. The policeman chuckled. You don't do things by halves, do you? As that one said, I light my way forward by the light of the fires of the bridges burning behind me. Okay, Dylan McKay. The agent shook his head and smiled. His partner came out of the house and they consulted with each other. The other officer shook his head and nodded toward Dan. Patrolman Diaz played the video from Dan's phone for his partner. His partner rolled his eyes and shook his head. Kendall's explanation had been very different, but she was unaware that she had been recorded. Patrolman Diaz turned to Dan. We're arresting your wife for domestic violence and terroristic threats. My suggestion is that you take out a restraining order. Patrolman Diaz opened the front door as his partner escorted Kendall from the kitchen, her hands cuffed behind her back. She was crying and beginning to hyperventilate. Dan, don't let them do this to me. Please, if you ever loved me, make them let me go. I promise I'll be good. Dan rolled his eyes and turned to the agent, who handed him a business card. My email address is on the card. Send me a copy of the video. As the patrol car drove away, Dan called his attorney, Dwight Solomon. It was exactly as I thought. She was arrested and taken to jail. Stay calm, Dan. If he shows up tomorrow, you know what to do. Plus, the next morning, as Kendall was leaving the courthouse accompanied by her parents, she was stopped by a blonde, gum-chewing blonde in her 20s. Excuse me, he said, as he stopped in Kendall's path. Are you Kendall Kenner? Yes, said a very tired, hungry, and annoyed Kendall Kenner. Who are you? You're already served, the blonde replied, as she handed an envelope to a surprised Kendall. The blonde patted her gum and turned her back to Kendall to leave. What is this shit? Kendall called to the blonde's back. I don't know. I don't care, the blonde said over her shoulder. But I'd say you're probably screwed, whatever it is. Kendall angrily opened the paper and saw the words, Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. That son of a bitch, he shouted to his parents. It had been a difficult morning. Kendall had been awakened early and taken out of her cell before being taken to a holding cell in another part of the building. She spent an hour in the cell before meeting with her lawyer. She had been allowed to make one phone call the night before and had used it to call her parents, who had immediately started leaving voicemails at various law firms so that, hopefully, they could get to work the next day. They had hired the first lawyer who returned their call the next morning and assured them that Kendall would be represented at the hearing. The judge set Kendall's bail at $10,000, which means she would have to deposit the full amount or pay a bondsman 10% and then pledge real estate as collateral. The judge also issued a restraining order prohibiting her from contacting her husband or showing up at his home or workplace. She was to make arrangements with her attorney to retrieve her belongings from the residence. Kendall's attorney had objected to this, but was later shown photos of Kendall's husband. The objection was withdrawn. After leaving the courthouse, Kendall's parents took her to McDonald's as her first stop. She had been booked into the Denton County Jail too late for dinner, and the jailers had woken her up early for her morning court appearance, so she had missed breakfast. Kendall hadn't eaten dinner the night before and had preferred to spend her time in bed with her boss, Tony. He had planned to grab some leftovers from the fridge when he got home, but the plan had gone awry. He thought about how he had gotten here. She and Tony had just finished their second sex session when an alert went off on her phone. As Tony dozed beside her, she checked her phone, expecting to see a message from Dan. What she saw instead was a low balance alert from her bank. She quickly logged into her bank's app and immediately saw that the joint bank account only had a few dollars on deposit. That same afternoon, the account had received 2 ACH withdrawals, one for $12,000 and another for $18,000. A Google search of the payees revealed nothing. Kendall knew that could mean they had been scammed or that the bank had made a mistake. Kendall was a smart woman. She also realized it could mean that Dan knew about their affair and had emptied the checking account. However, she didn't think that was the case. She knew her husband and knew he wasn't afraid of confrontation. If he had suspected she was having an affair, he would have said something. Dan Kenner was not the kind of man who would let something like that go. She knew that, and yet there she was, lying next to her boss in a cheap motel after having spectacular sex because of his mediocrity. Not for the first time, she wondered what she was doing here. Things had always been easy for Kendall. She was always the prettiest and smartest in the class. She was rarely the most popular because the other girls didn't trust her. From a very young age, she learned to use her sexuality as a weapon and didn't hesitate to draw it. Starting with Mr. Campbell, her high school calculus teacher. A few blowjobs earned her an A+. Letting Mrs. Donovan eat her pussy earned her an A in economics. She never dated high school boys. She only dated men, boys who had graduated from college and had good jobs. College was a repeat of high school. If she had problems with her lessons, she shagged the teacher. Men and women alike, everyone wanted to bang Kendall. She had graduated with a degree in finance in 4 years. She had thought about going to law school, but she knew she wasn't a good student. You couldn't get laid in law school. To Kendall, her ongoing affair with Tony Geyer, the senior manager she reported to, meant nothing. It was a means to an end. If she could engage in a little recreational sex, what a previous lover had called sports sex, while getting the promotion, so much the better. It was during his second year of employment at Chase Bank that he met Kyle Evans. Kyle had visited his bank branch as part of an investigation into possible money laundering activities by an alleged drug dealer. Kyle was assigned to the Special Operations Division of the Denton County Sheriff's Department, and his long hair, mustache, and devil-may-care attitude had made her hair stand on end. She shamelessly invited him out for drinks and slept with him at the end of their first date. For Kendall, the sex was mind-blowing, and she went crazy for Kyle. Within 2 months, they were living together. A year later, they were married. For Kendall, married life had been a revelation. She loved Kyle and wanted to do everything in her power to please him. Domestically or sexually, it didn't matter. Kendall and Kyle were perfect together. Until they weren't. They had been married for 4 years and were actively trying to have a child. They had not yet had any luck, but they enjoyed trying. Midway through their 4th year of marriage, Kyle was offered the opportunity to attend a 4-week course put on by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Although he would be gone for a month, having the ATF course on his resume would help Kyle when it came time for promotion. Going was a no-brainer. Kendall felt lonely but good during the first week of Kyle's absence. The second week was a little harder, as her hormones combined with her loneliness to increase her horniness. By the end of the 3rd week, Kendall was climbing the walls and masturbating twice a day. During the 4th week, Kendall agreed to go out for drinks with Bill Williams. William Williams, known as Bill Square, or more commonly as Square, was a former partner of her husband's at the Denton County Sheriff's Department. Kendall wasn't quite sure what had caused their falling out, but she knew they were no longer friends. She accepted his invitation for drinks with the vague idea that it might help her smooth things over. Besides, he was an attractive man and she was lonely. What could be wrong? Kyle had done very well in the ATF class. He was leading the class standings, which was important because going into the last week, whoever ranked first had the option of taking the final exam 3 days early. If he passed, he could leave early. If he failed, he had to stay for the rest of the class. Kyle passed the test, and 3 hours later he was on a plane to DFW to surprise his wife. It was 4 in the morning when the Uber dropped Kyle off in front of his darkened house. He recognized his ex-partner's car, Square, in the driveway. A cold fist gripped Kyle's heart as he opened the front door and entered the house he shared with Kendall. He set the suitcase by the front door as he walked softly toward the bedroom. The room was partially illuminated by light from the master bathroom. Square was lying on his back uncovered. His cock was crusted with Kendall's juices air drying. Kendall was lying on her side facing him, her arm draped across his chest. It was the same way she slept with her husband. Kyle pulled out his phone and began recording the couple as they slept. After about 30 seconds of recording, he snapped a few pictures and put the camera away. Next, Kyle walked over to Square's side of the bed, until tonight, Kyle's side, and clasped his hands together, interlocking his fingers. He then raised both hands above his head and with all his strength drove his joined hands down onto Square's penis. The blood-curdling scream that erupted from Square woke Kendall from her orgasm-induced dreamless sleep. She woke up startled and disoriented. She saw Bill crying and clutching his groin with both hands. She saw her husband standing over them, but for a moment her brain couldn't process what was happening, and then everything clicked into place. Kendall looked at her husband with a terrified face. She was slowly realizing the horror of what was happening. Her husband looked at her. His face was red with fury as he looked at his soon-to-be ex-wife. "I'll be back at 3 to pick up my stuff. I'll be done by 6. Don't be here during that time. I won't be responsible for my actions if I see you, and you don't deserve to go to jail or lose my job." Kyle grabbed Square by the hair and lifted his face to look him in the eye. "You sorry piece of shit. I'm going to send a copy of the video to your wife and HR. You better go and resign today because your career is over, and so is your marriage." Kyle punched him one last time in the nose, not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to make him vomit blood. He spun on his heels and left his house in Kendall. Kendall sighed as she remembered how hurt Kyle had been by her cheating. Her strapping husband was a wreck, and she feared he would never recover. He had refused all her attempts to contact him. He didn't want to see her or talk to her. She was divorced and her parents were supportive, explaining that it wasn't her fault. Kyle must have been very violent to hurt Bill so badly. His violent streak would have doomed their marriage sooner or later. Her story evolved into one of neglect and abuse on his part. Hadn't she shown her violent tendencies when she confronted Bill? While Kendall and her parents rewrote history to make her the victim, she became the heroine of her story. The brave girl who did what she had to do to escape the brute her husband had become. Only once was her fiction thrown in her face. Kendall was shopping at Engstrom's in Dallas when she came face to face with her ex-husband. He was with a tall, thin, beautiful woman. She had red hair and the body of an athlete. She looked vaguely familiar. She was pushing a stroller. Kendall's eyes had widened as she saw her ex-husband for the first time in 5 years. "Hi, Kyle," he stammered. "Hello, Kendall," she replied voicelessly. He held out his hand to the woman. "Hi, I'm Kendall. I used to be married to Kyle." "Yes, I've heard a lot about you," the woman replied as she shook Kendall's hand. Kendall had blushed at hearing that. Surely nothing good. "Some good, some not so good," the woman had replied. "I'm Corey Calloway. I'm Kyle's wife. This is our son, Kyle, Jr." Kendall had looked down at the sleeping baby. The hardest thing she had ever done in her life was to keep smiling as she looked at her ex-husband's new family. "He's a beautiful baby. You're a lucky woman to be married to Kyle. He's a good man." "It was good to see you again, Kyle." Kyle just glared at her, grabbed the woman by the hand and headed for the men's room as they pushed the stroller. A few days later, while watching the evening news, Kendall was surprised to see that the anchor woman was the woman she had seen with Kyle. That's why she looked familiar. Kendall had Googled Corey Calloway and discovered that she was an up-and-coming media talent who would likely end up on one of the national cable news channels. Local media observers had noted that while she was pretty enough, though not necessarily slutty and vapid enough, for Fox News, her intelligence made her a better fit for MSNBC, though she would have to develop a more condescending tone if she moved to that network. At the moment, she was becoming immensely popular on local news. Kendall had cried herself to sleep that night and every night for the next week until she remembered her fiction. Kyle was violent and emotionally abusive, wasn't he? It was only a matter of time before her new marriage ended as well. Kendall forced herself back to the present as she contemplated what divorce would mean for her. After eating her Egg McMuffin, Kendall demanded her parents take her home. "It's not a good idea, honey," her father had told her. "I need to talk to Dan. I need to explain to him what happened. We can work this out." "Ken," his mother began, "I don't think it's a good idea. The judge said—" "I don't care what the judge said," Kendall shooed her mother. "Just take me home." Kendall's parents had walked her to her front door and watched as she rang the doorbell. They stood there for a couple of minutes waiting, and then Kendall rang the doorbell again. When again nothing happened, Kendall started pounding on the door. Dan made a quick phone call before opening the front door, holding the security chain in place. "You're not supposed to be here. There's a restraining order keeping you away." "I live here," Kendall said. "How can we fix our marriage if I'm not here?" Dan looked at Kendall in disbelief. "Settling? I'm divorcing you. We're not fixing anything. I'm not staying married to a lying, abusive cheater. You need to get out of here." Dan closed the door, which infuriated Kendall, who began pounding on the front door. "Let me in, you cowardly son of a bitch! You've never seen abuse until you see what I'm going to do to your cowardly ass. Open the door, right now!" He began pounding frantically on the door. Seeing their daughter's distress, Kendall's parents began pounding on the door as well. As their daughter became more and more upset, their calls to Dan became louder and more emotional. "Open the door, Dan, or I swear to God I'll kill you. I'll rip your heart out with a steak knife," Kendall shouted. "Open the goddamn door, you goddamn grease monkey," Kendall's father shouted. "I'll put you down, boy." Dan took a sip of his coffee and shook his head as he watched the video from the doorbell camera. He watched as the patrol car pulled into the driveway and the two officers approached the porch. The officers talked to the group for a minute, and then one of them broke away and rang the doorbell. Dan opened the door and invited the officer in. After getting Dan's identification, the officer asked him for his side. He had noticed the cuts and bruises on Dan's face. "Last night I confronted my wife about an affair she is having. I have proof of the affair because I hired a private investigator. She became violent during the confrontation and attacked me," Dan said, pointing to the bruises on his face. "She was arrested last night and appeared in court this morning. She was issued a restraining order prohibiting her from entering his residence." Dan handed the officer the copy of the restraining order that his attorney had emailed to him. "I have this too," Dan said, as he showed his phone to the officer. He hit play and they watched a video of Kendall and her parents knocking on the door and making threats. The officer just shook his head as he watched them. "Well, this looks pretty straightforward. Send me a copy of the video," the officer said as he handed Dan a business card. He then tapped his shoulder mic and requested 2 more cars to make multiple stops. "Stay inside and watch the shit show from your phone. Don't leave your house until I tell you to." And that's how it happened. The officer called his partner to consult with him. They watched the video on his phone and then drove over to Kendall and her parents, where they were informed that they were all being arrested for trespassing and terroristic threats, and that, in addition, Kendall was being arrested for violating a restraining order. When two more patrol cars showed up, the officers began arresting Kendall and her parents. Kendall's mother became hysterical, and Kendall began crying and swearing at the officers. Kendall's father tried to push the officers away to get to his wife and was knocked to the ground. Shitty show was an understatement. Dan phoned his lawyer and left a message. Kendall and her parents just got arrested. I think I married into a family of idiots. Leroy Keyes felt defeated and dejected. He, his wife and daughter had been arrested Friday night for breaking and entering and threatening his son-in-law. Because they had been arrested on a Friday night, they spent the entire weekend in jail, waiting to see the judge on Monday morning. Leroy and his wife had restraining orders against Dan's home and business. In addition, Kendall's bond was revoked, and she was to remain in jail for violating the protective order and making terroristic threats against Dan. Leroy and his wife Sarah were able to make bail, but Kendall would remain in jail for the foreseeable future. Deep down, he knew he had failed as a father in raising Kendall. She was a spoiled, entitled, and probably narcissistic child, but she was also his little girl. His wife had spent the weekend sharing a cell with Kendall. Sarah hadn't wanted to talk about what they'd talked about, but when they'd released her, she'd seemed angry and determined. About what? Leroy had no idea. Leroy called the attorney he had used for Kendall's first arrest. Once he had explained the situation to the lawyer, he had taken pity on Larry, but Larry had told him that he was going on vacation and would not be available, which was true, but also a great coincidence because he felt the whole family was crazy and wanted nothing to do with them. Leroy scoured the yellow pages for lawyers until he found one who could help him right away. If Leroy had known anything about lawyers, it would have been the first red flag. Raleigh Cruz was not anyone's idea of what a lawyer looked like. Skinny, balding, with an aquiline nose and small, narrow eyes, Raleigh bore more than a passing resemblance to a vulture, sitting on a power line waiting for its prey to die so it could swoop down on the carcass. A phrase he vaguely remembered from a literature class long ago popped into Leroy's head. Something about a thin, hungry stare. Some ambulance chasers advertised on television and billboards. As you went down the pecking order, some ambulance chasers advertised on bus stop benches. Raleigh Cruz seemed to advertise in massage parlors and on Fox News. Fetch. He had actually said someone would fetch him like a stick being thrown at a dog. Raleigh was 20 minutes wallowing in the small room before someone went looking for him. A girl. Or at least she looked like a girl to Raleigh, who was barely out of high school. Lauren Davis was 32 years old and had graduated from Yale Law. Some might think it was the fact that her father, Lawrence Davis, was a named partner that put Lauren on the fast track to becoming a partner. They would have been wrong. It was her inherited natural abilities and affinity for law that made her a junior partner before she turned 30. Raleigh wasn't aware of any of that. She took one look at Lauren and dismissed her. When Raleigh sat down in the conference room, he was surprised to see Lauren sitting across from him. Her look had been amused when Raleigh began listing his client's requirements. That amused look turned wolfish when Raleigh finished his list. They had recordings of her daughter attacking her husband. They had recordings of your daughter violating the restraining order and threatening death. They had recordings of you and your wife making death threats. They had a prenuptial agreement that for some reason you forgot to mention to me. You've made me sound like a first-year law student instead of someone who has been practicing law for 30 years, Raleigh said bitterly. The whole affair had been a humiliating experience for Raleigh, and he was pissed off. I dismiss you as clients. Find someone else to take care of your bullshit. Oh, and here's my bill for the time you've wasted. Now get the hell out of my office. Kendall and her parents looked at Dan from across the conference room table. Kendall had dressed to the nines and knew she looked good. She wanted her husband to see what she was wasting. Dan watched Kendall in amused silence, oblivious to her attempts to make him regret his decision to divorce her. They had agreed on all the points of the divorce. There was not much to divide. They would each keep the things they came into the marriage with. Dan had bought the house during his first marriage and would keep the property, as Kendall had never been listed on the deed. She felt that Dan was not fully committed to their marriage. Dan saw it as his subconscious not fully trusting Kendall. In the end, they were both right. As part of the divorce settlement, Dan had demanded that Kendall return her wedding set, and he would return her wedding ring. She had put her rings in an envelope and passed it around the conference room to Dan. He didn't have an envelope, so he had taken the ring off his finger and slid it across the table to Kendall, where it remained throughout the meeting. As they stood, finished with the task that brought them together, for the last time, Dan had a question for Kendall. Can you tell me why? You had a good life. I know you loved me and I loved you. Why would you throw it all away for an affair? Kendall sighed and looked up for a moment before looking at Dan. I don't know. Boredom? Restlessness? Increasing my chances for promotion? Maybe a little of all three. What do you want me to say, Dan? Do I regret cheating on you? I regret getting caught. I can't say I regret the affair or the sex. That's just me. But you were a good husband. I wasn't a good wife. I don't know if I'll ever be a good wife. To anyone. Dan nodded. Kendall hadn't told him anything he didn't already know or guess. Kendall picked up her purse and papers and turned to leave. Kendall? She turned to look at Dan, who pointed to her wedding ring, which was still on the conference table. You should probably take it. Author's notes. The story of Kyle Evans and Corey Calloway has yet to be told. I'm pretty sure William Bill Squared Williams will appear in their story, and things probably won't go well for him.